Okay, so hello, my name is Bart, and I'll be talking today about Crystal. Okay, so I will focus about differences on Ruby and Crystal. So you will see basically a lot of Crystal code. So for those who are not very familiar with Ruby, might struggle a little bit, but I think you should be fine. Okay, so installation, again, it's basically system specific, so you need to go to the documentation, so I will not cover that. Okay, and how the default app structure looks like. Basically, you use a binary crystal, you init the application, you put a name. As a good practice, is always worth it to add a crystal version, because it will be very useful for deployments to control the version of the crystal. And this is the basic structure. So you got gitignore, editor config, etc. And here's your main file, which is in the folder src, and the version of the application and some basic specs. Okay, so simple hello world looks exactly the same as Ruby. So you have puts and hello world. Okay, if you want to run it, you just need to run it with Crystal and your source, or use a run command. This is the same. So what happened that Crystal, because it's statically typed language, it will compile the source and it will run the binary. If you just want to build without running, for example, when you're deploying application, you can use a build. It will produce a binary. So the simple binary of this hello world program, it will take about 1 meg. But because this is a debug mode, if you want to release it, especially in production, you should add a release flag. And if you want to put all the dependencies, system dependencies into the binary, you can use as static. And this is how the size of the file is increased. But usually you don't want to compile with a static option. Okay, so dependencies. In Ruby we have Ruby gems and GitHub. For the Crystal, we've got shards, Crystal shards, and GitHub. This is where the most shards live. Okay, except for the game file and game file log, we've got shards yam and shards log. And instead of doing bundle check and bundle install, we're doing shard checks and shard install. Okay, so requiring a file name. So when we acquire a file for Crystal, first we need to define what is the required path. So required path is the location of the standard library that comes with the compiler. So this is basically standard library of the Crystal, and the lib directory in your current project. Okay, so if you require file, whether it's a library or relative, it will first look up for this exact file. If it's not found, then it will go for the directory and the file name in this directory. It needs to be called the same. If not, it will produce an error. So in Ruby, we've got require relative. So this is not needed because you can just use dot notation. Okay, so there are also other forms. Like you can use this that will include all the files in this directory, or recursively all other subfolders too. So in Ruby, you would need to do dir each. I didn't even want to write the whole thing here. Okay, so consts. Consts are, very simple. So you assign const, but you can also create a block for the const. You can compute something here, and it will be cached into this const, and this will only execute once. Types. Okay, so because Crystal is statically typed, there are a couple of types here. I will go almost for everyone. Okay, so integer. So in Ruby we got a fixed num and big num. So we don't care about the range for the type. Here we need to remember that wherever we are using some numbers, there is a range specific to it. So we've got integers that are signed, so it can take a negative numbers, and unsigned that are basically 0 to their maximum range. And because of that in Ruby, type is automatically changed. So if I exceed my range, it will go to another class. For example, fixed num will go to the big num. But here we've got a typical arithmetic overflow, so if my range is over, it will start from 0 or from negative something. So that's very important to remember. Okay, so this is basically the same for the Ruby. You can format it this way. There's a binary version, octal version, and hexadecimal version. And by default, if you use numbers in Crystal, it's int 32. If you want to specify other type, you can suffix it with the specific type. Okay, float, the same. You can format it here and here. And by default, it's equal to double if you don't have a specifier. And if you want to have it, float version, which is 4 byte, this you need to use F32. Okay, character. So again, in Ruby, we don't have character representation because it just is a string. Here, single quote means that this is a character, and you need to remember that. So string can only be used by double quotes. Okay, and this is another difference, that in Ruby, strings are mutable by default. In Crystal, they are not. Of course, there's a multi-line support, so you can use like this, but it will take all the spaces here. So you need to use either this version or this to remove preceding spaces, or you can use here doc. This is interpolated here doc, and if you use single quotes, this won't be interpolated. Okay, symbols. This is actually less flexible in Crystal because they need to be defined at compile time, so you cannot create them dynamically. So, but you don't have to use them because you've got native support for the enums. And they in the contrast to symbols, they will be checked for errors. So it's preferred way to use enums over symbols. Okay, so every enum is by default starts from 0 and goes by 1. You can change that if you want. And there is also a specific attribute. This is called attributes in the Crystal, that you can change how this is enumerated. So this be in the power of 2. So you can combine the flags like here. Okay. Okay, so how the array looks like. So this is basically literal of the array, and it translates to this type. This is array of integer 32 because that's the default number. Okay, if I put other values to my array, it's going to be something that is called union type. So this is the array that accepts these 3 types. Nothing else can go here if I want to expand it. And if you want to explicitly say that my number should be only 8-bit long, then you can use the off operator. And because the type needs to be known at the compile time, if you want to create an empty array, you need to use off and type specifier. There's no other way. So this basically translates to this. Okay. Another difference is that in Ruby, if you use array first or access any element by index, it will return nil. In Crystal, it's the other way around. If you, by default, it rises error. If you want to check if it's nil, you need to add a question mark. And that's for many methods. Okay. And I like that literal, it's something new in Crystal, but what it really is in practice is the initializer list. So if you see a construct like this, that is in a type and curly braces with some fields, it means that basically this expands to this. So it creates a new object and appends all the elements. So you can add the support for every class you want, but this is the requirement. So the constructor must be without arguments, and the whole class needs to respond to the append method. Okay, hash, very similar to what we have in Ruby. Is using arrows. That's very important to remember. And this basically translates to this type, that the key is an integer and the value is an integer. If we use a mixed types, compiler will automatically detect or infer the type. So the key is integer or character, and the value is integer. And the same as with array, if you want to have empty hash, you need to specify the type, like this or that. Okay, so here's another example. This is a hash-like type literal, the same with array, because it starts with curly braces. Of course, for hash it's not useful because you can just omit this. But for example, there's in standard library, there's HTTP headers class, and this basically translates to this. So it's just a shorter version of this. So it's very nice. And like I said, it's for array. So by default, it won't, in Ruby, it would return a nil, but here it will return an error. So if you want to check if it's nil, you can do it like that with the question mark. Okay, and here is the new concept that doesn't exist in Ruby. It's a tuple and NamedTuple. So what is a tuple? Tuple is a finite an ordered list. So you cannot add new elements once it's created. It has a fixed length. So this is a tuple. It has 3 types because they are corresponding to their indexes. And if there's a NamedTuple, and here's the difference, that's not a hash like you would see in Ruby, which is other variant of whether you have a string or a symbol keys. So this is basically a different type. It's a NamedTuple. Okay, so I was talking about types and union types, so how this looks like in practice. So this is just a string. If you want to create a type that consists of many types, you just pipe it. But this is very common that if there is a string or nil, you can just write it like that. It's string with a question mark. And you can create your own types. So you can use aliases. Again, this in Ruby, it means something completely else. So my type will be either string or int32. Or you can even create recursive types that it accepts nil, string, hash, that its key is a string, and as a value it can take a recursive type, which means it will again can take one of these 3. Okay, proc, it's like the lambda in Ruby. It's basically very similar. So here's the without arguments. It's only if you want to, that's the type, is a proc and a return value. Here you can specify arguments for the proc. So if you specify at least one, you will see that it's going to accept integer and it returns a string, and you got 2 arguments, etc. And basically this is equivalent of not of this one, but you can specify it like this or like that. Okay, you can also convert a method to a proc by prefixing with the lambda sign. And also you can specify a receiver, like here, string and count. Okay, and also there's a shortcut version for blocks like we have in Ruby. So it's very similar. It's an ampersand dot and same method. So basically these 2 are the same. Okay, what's more? Okay, so actually I should show this something. Okay, never mind. It's not about proc. This is just a simple method that yells twice. But the interesting thing is that the break can now return a result, which is not possible in Ruby. Okay, so there is no logical operation or an end. There is only double ampersand or double pipe. And control expressions. Okay, so this is something I like to point out. And if you need to remember only one slide from this presentation, it should be this one. Because of the concurrency model in Crystal, it's possible that if you check here, this only applies for the instance and class variables. So if you check here, it might be true, but once it goes here, this instance variable might be modified by another fiber, which is lightweight thread in Crystal, and it might be nil. So you need to be careful when you're using it. So that's the one solution. You can just assign it before you check it, or you can use this try block, which is much better than this. Okay, loops ambiguity removed. So in Ruby we got multiple ways of doing while loops. In Crystal this confusion was removed. Even math regrets adding this. So you can just, so here first it will be checked for the condition, then the code will be executed, but here first the code will be executed, then the condition will be checked. So here you can write the same in Crystal in Ruby, like this. Okay. Okay, so there's some naming changes. So for example, in Ruby, for every two methods that do the same, like map collect, in Crystal there is only one. And usually it's better named. Like for example, for Ruby inject, in Crystal there's a reduce, etc. So again, also like if you have method that respond to exist in Ruby, in Crystal usually it will be response exists. So again, it's much better. It's proper English actually. Okay, so again, there are three. For some classes, this might mean something else, but usually it's the same in Ruby. So in Crystal, there's only one size. And then again, there are multiple ways of doing lambda in Ruby. In Crystal, there is only one. Okay, so the case. Okay, I don't see it from here. Okay, so basically this case in the Crystal expands to something like this. So it's using, if you have multiple checks here, so it expands this to the OR, and using a triple equality sign, like in Ruby. So this is basically the same behavior. And if you specify in the checks types, then it's not going to expand to this, but it's going to expand to the is a string. Okay? And there's an addition that it doesn't exist in Ruby, that if you have an object and you use a dot and some method, then basically it's going to be like that. So it's a nice shorthand. Okay, so there's another thing, that's the tuple with the new type that was introduced in Crystal. You can check the specific values. So as you can see, there's a tuple that I check, and if it matches those two elements, it's basically it's gonna execute this code, this block. I can check one element and ignore the other one. And here is with this dot method thing. Of course, that's what I should mention, that tuples will expand to the end always, not like it was before to the OR. And the same basically applies with the types is a and is a. Okay, so classes. Okay, you can specify a type. So basically, that's how normal class would look like. Of course, the type is optional because it will be inferred on the compilation step. You can have default parameters, but there is a nice shorthand, as you can see, that if I specify a @ sign before attribute here, it will automatically create this line for me, so I don't have to write that. And this also works with the default parameters. Okay, so in Ruby, in classes, we've got accessor, readers, and reader and writers. So this is the equivalent of the Crystal. So it's property, getter, and the setter. And you can specify even optional type if you want to force it. Okay, so methods. In Ruby, there is no way to write multiple methods, to overload methods, to write the same method name with different parameters, because Ruby doesn't have types. So you can specify different types and clean up a code sometimes a little bit if you just differentiate in the code your types. Also, here's a become older and here's become older. It does not have the type, but because this method yields, it's considered a different signature from this one. Okay, so return, you can specify a return type if you want. Sometimes it's a good thing if you want to your compiler take care of it, that you don't forget some specific case, that it will return nil or something. And there is some extra stuff that even if you have some return type, that here it will be integer 32, if you specify nil as a return type, this method will always return nil. In Ruby you would basically write additional nil at the end. Sometimes you want to return the nil at the end of your method, so in Crystal you can do it like that. Okay, so method arguments in Crystal, you can call it based on positions or based on keywords. So it's up to you. But if you use X as a position, Y as a position, then you can mix them, though you can call them in different order if you're using a named arguments. So yeah. Okay, so here's the general description, what kind of parameters you can have. So let's consider now the splats. So everything, if you put this is similar to Ruby, but in Ruby you've got an array. In Crystal it would be a tuple. So with a single asterisk, you will have elements as a tuple. And if you use a double splat, you will have a named tuple. So that's what you need to remember. Okay, and this is again new concept. If you have consider this method, like if you have increment value by element, so I would call it like increment 10 by 1. So like this is the comment, okay, value by. So this reads a little bit weird, but you can create an internal alias for your argument in method by specifying another word. So the method still will accept by as a parameter, but internally you can use amount. So this is much better to read. Okay, and there's a tuple splat. So if you have a tuple and you put asterisk sign before it, this will basically expand. So x will be 1 and 2 will be y. And if you have a name tuple, so if you mix the order, it will automatically assign proper keywords to the proper arguments. Okay, visibility. So in Ruby, basically it's private, protected, and public by default. So it's similar to what you have in Ruby, but the difference is here that in Ruby you define one keyword private, and everything that is below it's private. Here you need to define it for every method. So that's a thing. And what is better though, that if you want to make constant private, you don't have to use this private constant from Ruby, but you can just specify a private modifier in front of a constant. Okay. Abstract classes. So in Ruby you cannot force a specific base class that it will, for example, create your interface for your class. For example, if you create an adapter and other services that will inherit from this adapter. So if you want to have a unified implementation, you can use abstract classes. In Ruby, you need to take care about the typos. If something is not implemented, you need to raise not implemented error, for example. Here you can just force it at the compilation level. Okay, generics. So again, new concept. This is similar. This is basically like generics in Java, templates in C++, etc. So I will not discuss that. Just want to mention about that. And Structs is another concept that every class in Crystal it's allocated on the heap. So if you allocate a memory for this object, it will be, put in somewhere in the memory. But in struct, the memory allocated by the struct is contiguous. So if I have like here x and y, it's gonna take probably 8 bytes. So this is useful for the performance sometimes, because you might want to pass by a value rather than the reference. And in some cases it might speed up your application. Yeah. Okay, so in general, what I think about Crystal, that they kind of looked at the Ruby and they fixed many imperfections of it. It's still it's very flexible, but it fixes, for example, like I said, there are 2 methods for doing the same, which personally I thought this is a bad decision for Ruby. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
How much of the usage of the Crystal you see in the production projects today?
Not many. Actually, I don't know if there is any system that is like big project that are in production. I can tell you that in Celio I built 2 projects, so you can consider this production. But Crystal is very mature. So, for example, we were talking with Tom before the presentation. I already told this, but concurrency in Crystal. The problem that maybe that's one of the problems which is not popular yet is the concurrency model, because they currently using only 1 core of the hardware, and you cannot spawn a thread that will use other cores of your hardware. It's a concurrent software, so you can spawn multiple light threads like fibers, but it will only run on the single core. So, but they are working on the true parallelism. Yeah.
Is that intentional or just temporary imperfection?
They are working on it. So, yeah. It's 0.25. So it's not major. Yeah. So. Yes. Like if you have experience with Ruby and other programming languages, it's very easy to switch. You just read documentation, something you don't know, you go look up and you just write it.
What about the library ecosystem?
Standard library or the whole ecosystem like gems in? So gems, no, it's much worse. Because not many people are using it yet, so there's not much packages out there. Yeah. Yeah, it's getting bigger, like for example for GraphQL, so you can already find a shard for that. There's some authentication shards. Yeah. Testing is also not well developed yet. That's one of the applications I developed. I had to mock some networking, and I wasn't able to do that because the Crystal has some built-in specs. They are inspired by RSpec, but currently there are 2 libraries. One is called spec2, the other I think mock something. And they don't work because the smoking worked before they released Crystal 0.24, I think. Now it doesn't work. Something changed. I don't know what.
So what is your prediction for the future? Like what should happen or would happen that would help to grow the Crystal?
I think the biggest problem right now is like when you develop a Ruby application, you have tools like binding pry where you can, just put a breakpoint in your application and check everything. But because this is statically typed, you need to work it like with a statically typed language. So for example, you can create a breakpoint, run a software, it will stop the normalized breakpoint, but there are no tools around it yet. You can just do it, from console, spawn like a GNU debugger or LLDB. This is from LLVM debugger, but there's a lot of weird stuff you need to do in order to make this work. So once this is okay, then yeah, you should be using it. Yes.